Our Officer Candidate School CO, uh, Captain John Connors, was a West Point grad and had a combat tour in Vietnam. He gave us excellent training, and I had some prep schools for the Vietnamese culture and so on. But there's really no way to prepare until you set foot on the ground. And it it was bizarre. It was otherworldly. Um, First, I flew there on Braniff Airlines,
Mm.
had regular stewardesses. I remember stepping off the plane, looking back and seeing a stewardess standing at the doorway, wondering what she was thinking. I know what I was thinking. Go off to buses that were had this protective glass and wire all over them. Had a couple of weeks of training at a place called Zion. And then I was flown to my I was flown to Baltrai, which is in Hania province, and was flown there by Air America. It was a CIA airline. I was the only passenger. And the pilot said, I don't know if we can land or not, because I heard they took incoming earlier today.
Mm.
That's when it hit me that, oh my God, this is real.
What do you remember about the the plane itself? And here I think I'm focusing on the last leg, wherever you flew, that last leg, wherever you flew from. What
Right.
do you remember about the atmosphere on the plane, the sort of the vibe on the plane as you know now, you take off and you know you're in the air heading for South Vietnam?
I felt alone because as I was assigned as an individual to a mobile advisory team. And I don't know if I just tuned out, but I have no recollection of the other people on the plane. There weren't any military units that I recall on the plane. It was mostly just individuals. I guess I was just distracted
Yeah.
and wondering what was I getting into, what was going to happen.
As you were describing just sort of that feeling that you don't remember anybody else on the plane, you know, there's so many things, as I talk to Vietnam vets, so many things that make this war just so hard. And one, it seems to me, is the solitariness of it. And of course, you hear from vets that they feel this very strong bond with these guys they serve with. But you also hear that, if a guy that I had a really strong bond with, if he's hit and medevaced, the vast majority of the time, I won't have any idea what happened to him. He's not here anymore. And there's just that sense of isolation. You go into the country alone, you leave alone. We don't know what happened to our buddies who got hit most of the time or a lot of the time. There's that. Does this resonate at all with your own experience? Just a strong sense of, yes, you're with the army, you're with your unit, but there's also this strong sense of solitariness.
Yes, the after landing in Baltra, I was picked up by a helicopter and choppered out to district headquarters of Duckway District, part of Hania Province. And I was the only passenger. I was dropped off at district headquarters, and the the district team at that time probably was comprised of about 10 to 13 personnel, excluding our mobile advisory team. And there to greet me was Jim Smith. My mother called him her fifth son
Mm.
after after the war was over. But everybody's experience who served was unique. There was a sense of isolation, but the camaraderie among us was strong.
Mhm.
Our NCOs were second tour, and they knew the drill. And I had learned enough to keep my mouth shut most of the time,
Mhm.
uh, and learn from these guys. So the team started out at full strength, but most of the time we didn't have a medic. It was just 3 or 4 of us, and our job was to rotate among local South Vietnamese regional and popular forces. The regional forces were generally thought of as province oriented, and the popular forces to the districts. And so the regional forces had wider operating areas than the popular forces.
You said that when you got off the plane, you saw that flight attendant there and you were wondering what she was thinking. Then you said, but you knew what you were thinking. What were you thinking in those first couple minutes in South Vietnam?
It seemed surreal that I'm leaving an aircraft, a commercial aircraft with stewardess going off to war.
Mhm.
And it's like entering another dimension.
A veteran told me the other day that if he was using the same language, he said if he had seen a dinosaur in Vietnam, it wouldn't have surprised him.
Yeah, that's apropos.
And then this is just sort of a basic thing, but maybe for folks who don't know, you said that when you got on the bus windows had wiring over them. What was the reason for that?
Keep out grenades.
Right. Did you know that at the time when you got on the bus and you saw the wiring,
Yes,
I mean, you knew why the wiring was there?
yes.
Where in Three Corps were you though? Were you in sort of southwestern Three Corps?
More Western. Um, we were west of Cu Chi, and the what bordered the district was the Vam Co Dong River, or I should say it bordered the province. West of the river lay Cambodia. So we were, depending on the bend of the river, we were roughly, say, from 10 to 15 miles east of the Cambodian border.
Now you are then assigned to a mobile advisory team. And what was the basic mission of a mobile advisory team?
In theory, it sounded good. Um, it was to teach tactics, weaponize them, teach them how to use M16s. We gave classes how to use the Claymore mine, for example. Uh, we set up target ranges for them to learn how to shoot the M16s. When we had a medic, uh, his first job was to attend to us, and secondary was to help aid South Vietnamese soldiers when it occurred. The irony of, though, the actual role for us, anyhow, it wound up being coordinating artillery and helicopter gunship support when we got attacked. The supply chain for the regional popular forces was ineffective. Um, ARVN, the regular army of South Vietnam,
Yeah,
in general, was better supplied.
okay.
So the our sergeants were excellent at scrounging material. The majority of my action occurred at this one outpost we called An Dien. And this was a company-sized regional forest outpost that had maybe 70 soldiers. Um, we were camped in the middle of it. And within that hedgerow, which is basically a square-shaped enclave of palm and palm trees, there was, we had two 50 caliber machine guns and an M60 that the sergeants had scrounged. And we had a 60 millimeter mortar that the sergeants had scrounged. So in theory, that wasn't the way we were supposed to operate. But in reality, survival mode always kicked in, and we did whatever we could to improve their defenses. If their supply chain worked at all, it was slow. And actually, we didn't get, we were supposed to work off the South Vietnamese supply chain as well. But in reality, we were supported by the 25th Infantry Division that operated out of Cu Chi. And they're the ones that supplied us with ammunition and mortar rounds.
You say that, you know, the regional forces, popular forces, that they were not well supplied. Do you think the black market has something to do with that? Things that,
It's a good question. You know, I couldn't speak Vietnamese. I mean, I understood a few phrases, but it was a very complex situation. It was a civil war, a religious war, and a political war. And where we were in this remote area were primarily South Vietnamese farmers. And they were being hit on both sides. In other words, Viet Cong might come in, request to be hidden or collect some tax money, and then the South Vietnamese would come in and want to tax them and so forth and so on. So their loyalties were twisted and or conflicted, and you know, they wanted to live. So the reality was we didn't really know. Uh, I suspect the black market was in play.
yeah, I mean, things that should on paper have gone to the RFs, you know, get into the black market and end up being sold to, I mean, potentially Viet Cong or just someone else who wants it. That would be my guess.
Yeah, or the district chiefs might have intervened and sent the material where they wanted it to go.
What was your overall perception of the regional forces you worked with? Did you find them on the whole capable and interested in taking the initiative?
It depended on leadership, like any organization. The most effective commander, in my opinion, that I worked with, his name was Trung Nguyen Hat. He had been fighting for 17 years. So when he was in charge and when we worked with him, we didn't have a problem. His troops were motivated because of his leadership. And and if there's time, I could give you kind of a supernatural encounter with him years later after the war. But the leaders, the units would rotate. And so at one point we had a really good regional force unit at End In, and Trung Nguyen Hat, actually Trung Nguyen means lieutenant, by the way. He operated out of another outpost. So we had one good commander and then one lousy commander. And like one time in the lousy commander, Jim and I came across a couple of soldiers, they were having a cockfights, you know, which is poor discipline. And so it's nothing new, it's leadership.
As the American officer, the advisor there, when you had these South Vietnamese leaders, these regional force leaders who were not good leaders, was there much you could do?
Good question. We could report to our district commander. His name was Ray Wing. Ray was special forces, but not in a special forces assignment because we were regular Army.
Right.
And he let us pretty much operate as we saw fit. So we could report it to him. He could report it to his cohort or his comparable South Vietnamese leader. Usually it would have been the district chief. And he may or may not do something. So it was very difficult. You couldn't just, we had no authority to relieve anyone of command.
When you leave in 1970, in mid-70, based on what you had seen over the past 12 months, were you confident that the South Vietnamese, just based on your own experience, were you confident that the South Vietnamese would be able to stand on their own?
No. No, it wasn't even close. And in my opinion, the loss of the war began with the assassination of President Ziem back in 1963. He was corrupt, but he was strong. And there was no one single leader strong enough to unite the South Vietnamese people after his demise. So I had no faith at all that the South Vietnamese would be able to hold out. And in parting, I remember I had a conference with our province senior advisor, and he encouraged me to stay in. And I thought, well, it'd be cool to go back to the States for a year, get my captain's bars, and I knew I'd be sent back to Vietnam. And I knew in my gut it wasn't worth it. It it was a quagmire.
Yeah. And you describe in what you write, so we'll flip sides and go over to the Viet Cong and the NBA. These guys who you describe sappers who begin crawling, toward the position that they're going to attack where you are, they start crawling toward the fence hours before. You describe an enemy that's tenacious, that is overwhelmed with the technology that American firepower can bring. You describe these hunter-killer teams, these loaches and cobras that come in, these helos that unleash, especially the cobras, these helos that unleash so much firepower on them, the artillery, and yet they're incredibly persistent. Did it ever, go through your mind the question, why is it that these RFs I'm working with, at best I'm ambivalent about them. I'm not, it seems sometimes they're with it, sometimes they're not. Whereas the adversary seems to be understanding that there are some who give up, the Chuhois, and you write about them. There's some that give up. They experience exhaustion, they experience despondency. But on the whole, on the other side, there is just a high level of perseverance. Did that ever go through your mind? Like, why? Why is one side, generally speaking, so persevering, and the other side, generally speaking, it doesn't seem like you can really count on it?
This is speculation, but I suspect that the motivation often was fear instilled by North Vietnamese leadership. You do this or you die. From what little I could gather from the few captured Viet Cong was that they were often lied to. Like they weren't aware that there were any Americans at the Sound Den outpost, for example. I remember going up to one captive who was being interviewed by a regional force soldier, and he looked up at me, and it was like he was shocked.
You mentioned a few minutes ago a sort of you referred to kind of a supernatural interaction with, is it Lieutenant Hot there?
Yes.
What was that?
Well, after the war, I mean, I didn't live particularly well, but in the mid 80s, I started these long motorcycle tours solo. and 15 years apart in rural parts of New Mexico. The first occurred in 85, I think it was. The last I saw of our interpreter, who Jim and I really loved, he was loyal. I had seen him in the amputee ward of a Saigon hospital. So in what I call a visitation, he appears whole. He had this infectious smile and he says, "I'm okay." And then he's gone. 15 years later, I'm on the Arizona-New Mexico border in this little burg called Mogollon. And Trung We Hat appears. And I have no idea what happened to him. I suspect he was killed or captured when the communists overran the country. But he's also whole. And I tell him, excuse me, I've been looking for you for 25 years. He doesn't say anything, but he leans, we raise up and we hug each other, and then he's gone.
What happened to the interpreter?
After Jim rotated back to the States, I had the team, and then they sent in a captain who was brash, wouldn't listen, and I'd already earned my Bronze Star for valor. Well, I was away from the outpost. He responded to a call that a local had found a booby trap. So he takes our interpreter out and they trip the booby trap. Sergeant Ton was seriously wounded and medevaced out. And the captain, he had been there 2 weeks, had been medevaced out. I visited him and I have intentionally forgotten his name. I visited him and wherever he was recuperating. He was wounded, but didn't lose any limbs. And I wrote this BS type letter to his parents, saying what a fine soldier he was. But obviously, I still have ill feelings toward that experience because one, he wouldn't listen, and two, he put our interpreter in harm's way.
And did your interpreter lost a leg?
Well, this is embarrassing. I don't know what he lost. When I saw him in the hospital, he was completely bandaged and he was under the sheets. And I didn't inquire. I just, was it a lack of courage or was it I didn't want to intrude on whatever he was feeling? I did know that he was glad to see me. And, but that was the last time I saw him.
One of the stories you relate is of a Vietnamese girl
Yeah.
who also hit a mine. Are you willing to share that story?
Well, there's not much to tell. I just remembered seeing this girl with basically no expression on her face, uh, leaning back and holding her ankle to stem the flow of blood. Now, she was being attended to, but there was no foot. And it just struck me about how indiscriminate a minefield can be. Because while this area we served in was remotely or sparsely populated, there were villagers and farmers who lived there with children. And, children are apt to wander about.
You received a Bronze Star. What's the story behind that?
Smith was at another outpost that night. So it was just me and Sergeant Rivaldo at the Indian outpost. And we started taking incoming and the first round hit right on top of the clay tile roof, which at that time was our headquarters. And I grabbed the radio and either a fragment of the tile or shrapnel struck Rivaldo on the head, but it bounced off. It didn't hurt him, fortunately, but my knees shook. And that's the only time I really remember being scared. I thought we were going to be overrun, or I feared we were going to be overrun. But it was the heaviest attack we had experienced. And it was a ground assault as well as a mortar assault. And it lasted 3 to 4 hours. So anyway, I got on the horn and then I called in artillery. And when it arrived, I literally felt like the cavalry had come when I heard the first round whistle overhead. And so that continued. Had artillery support. It was American artillery support. And then the Cobra gunships got on station. And at one time, Spooky, or the cargo plane with the miniguns, which would still fear in anybody or anything, on station, and it fired. And I was pleased with the impact award of the next few days of getting the Bronze Star, but in reality, I felt good about that, but I was doing my job. I mean, it was what I was trained to do, is what I was supposed to do. And herein comes the irony. The next morning, the Vietnamese soldiers, many of them came up to me and called number one. Their ranking system was 1 to 10. 1 was top of the list. You didn't want to be a number 10 with the South Vietnamese. And so a little later, this contingent of villagers is walking up the road, and I'm standing on the road at the time, and I frankly don't remember who was with me. I think just a couple of South Vietnamese soldiers. So this lady walks up. We called them Mama Sons. There's a family, it looked like, walking up the road, and she's carrying a box. It sounds like fiction, but it's not. So she lays this box on the ground and points directly at me. Now I look down and it's a dead baby. So my immediate thought is, oh my God, I'm responsible for killing the baby. And over years of therapy, both private and inside the VA, I came to realize that, all right, my takeaway now is that I was partially responsible, but I have no clue as to what circumstances under the baby's death occurred. It could have been by the enemy. I don't remember seeing any wounds on the baby. Could have been accidentally smothered if they tried to protect them. I don't know. But again, it's another one of those realities of war, which eventually led me to there is no such thing as untainted glory.
So there's that paradox. On the one hand, you're worried about your outpost being overrun. My assumption is, had you not called in that artillery, had you not called in those Cobras, had that not happened, then, there's a good chance your outpost would have been overrun with probably significant loss of life. So I think we can you know, we can say that you probably prevented some South Vietnamese soldiers and a couple Americans who were there, a few Americans who were there, prevented them from being injured or killed. But then there's this other side that calling in the artillery led to this consequence with the baby. But as you say, that's it's not clear. But it wasn't clear that the baby was hit by shrapnel. It's not clear how the baby died, and it sounds like no one offered an explanation about what happened.
Well, and that, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if our interpreter was there that night or not. Because there was the language barrier, and obviously I would have liked to have known.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I didn't receive any negative body uh, gestures from the South Vietnamese soldiers, as a result of this incident. I think they accepted it as a casualty of war, a tragic one. But and one step further, when Jim and I returned to Vietnam in 1996, and Jim had been ill the day that I took a ride with a hired interpreter, and I wanted to go back to the Indian outpost, and we're going down the road, and when I see this hedgerow, it was one of the strongest emotional reactions I've ever had in my life. And the way I eventually wrote about it was as I had come out of that hedgerow and greeted myself.
And this hedgerow was in the area where you had served?
That was it. That was the Indian outpost.
I see.
And it's like you left part of yourself there.
What you just described, sort of, you know, living with the heavy memory of knowing that, you know, as a result of things you called for on the radio, you called those Cobras in, you called that artillery in, that as a result of that, you know, within minutes of those calls going in, you know, some human beings departed this life. Um, you also say that there's a sense of loss, and you don't use that word exactly, but there's a sense of loss or a sense of having missed something by not, with your own M16, knowing that you had personally dispatched an enemy. So on the one hand, there's that sense of heaviness that comes with knowing that things I did led to the loss of life on the other side. Of course, the the other part of that is it also led to the preservation of life on your side, and that's, I guess that's the basic fact of war. But there's that heaviness of knowing that things I did led to loss of life. But then there's that also a sense of having missed out in some sense because I never personally, with my own weapon, took out an adversary. And so I'm just interested in hearing you reflect on that.
In my head, that was part of my mission. I was infantry. And so I failed that part of my mission, or didn't complete that part of my mission, but it wasn't so much I wanted to kill somebody. I just thought it was part of my assigned mission. I feel less strongly about that now.
Mm.
And going back to the Cobra pilots and the door gunners, they often saw the what they did. So they were more likely to be affected in the way I'm talking about, as opposed to jet pilots or B-52 pilots. Be that as it may, I don't really have a clearer explanation. Let's say it's conflict within me. it's part of the training, and the government gives you permission to kill. So, it's okay. That's the way you're trained. And military forces wouldn't work without it. So, uh, all I can say is that it was the training that was imbued in becoming an infantryman.
You referred to, the body count policy and, how do we know that we're winning this war? Because it's not a territory war in that, we take this territory and hold it. So we know we're winning because, body count, that's the idea. And you say that I believe that when this was put into play, that is when, this policy of counting, so, that way we can determine whether we're winning or not. So I believe that when this policy of body count was put into play, a dehumanized American soldier began to emerge. What did you mean by that?
So the body count put in by McNamara, in my opinion, was one of the most horrific, dumbest, callous uh, policies ever implemented. And by what I mean by dehumanizing the American soldiers, I think it helped plant in the minds that our job was to kill. Well, there was no emphasis or little emphasis placed on what the military and civilian organizations tried to do in terms of building schools and trying to bring their like learn to use pumps for rice paddy dikes to move water out of one flooded dike into another, sort of thing. Of course, in hindsight now, I look at that differently, because it's like you cannot impose your will on another culture. But what we try to do was lead by example. And to me, that's one of the horrific after effects of the war, is that there were South Vietnamese who believed in what we were doing, what we were trying to provide, and then we abandoned them. The only way we could have won the war at that stage would have been to have a continual presence. And of course, politicians and the American public wouldn't stand for that.
Yeah. So in your mind, the body count policy, the incentive that gives to combatants, the incentive that gives to the military, that went against, you've got this other thing which is not emphasized as much, but the hearts and minds stuff, the civic action work, the the medical projects in the villages. The emphasis on body count brutalizes the people involved because, well, why are we here? We're here to kill. And of course you're in a war, and so that's obviously part of it.
Right.
But the bigger picture is we're here to help South Vietnam stand up on its own. And so I think what I'm hearing you say is that this policy gives the military incentives that brutalizes the people who are carrying the policy out. And then those folks then are not in frame of mind then really to interact well with the Vietnamese and win the South Vietnamese and win them over because of the mindset that has been created by this policy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's well expressed, Preston. When I got back, I completed my CPA. But I was told by executive recruiters not to put Vietnam on my resume. I went back to work for at that time was one of the big 8 public accounting firms. They wanted me to go back to work the day I returned from Vietnam. I mean, Um, which led me to this saying that the government, the US knows how to send troops to war, but it doesn't know how to bring them back.
It sounds like part of what you're saying also is that the body count policy, which everyone is aware of in the States,
Yes,
that not only does that have an impact on the military in Vietnam, on combatants in Vietnam, it has a psychological impact on them. You know, why do we exist? We exist for this purpose, period. Um, which that makes sense, but you know, but the bigger goal is to help South Vietnam to stand up on its own. Um, but it has a psychological impact on the combatants, but it also has a psychological impact on the population back home because it shapes how we think about these guys who are in Vietnam. So
right.
if you're in Vietnam and I'm at home and this is the perception I have, then when you come home from Vietnam, then the perception I have of you is the perception that that policy, that body count policy, helped to create. And I'm not asserting this. I'm just wondering, is this part of your, is this kind of how you
That's
see it?
that's the way I experienced it. You know, my three brothers had all been officers, but just because of timing, had never been in combat. Um, so my family didn't really get it. And in all fairness to them and the public, when I came back, I didn't really know how to talk about it, but people didn't want to hear about it anyway. My feeling was they just wanted to go away. It was like we were asked to deny the part of ourselves that at that time in our lives was the biggest thing that had ever happened. The way I reflect on my performance overall is I was good defensively. I wasn't particularly offensive minded, so to speak. For one, the targets were elusive.
Mm.
Um, you'd see, you couldn't tell. On the rare occasion I saw enemy soldiers in the field, you couldn't detect them from any other South Vietnamese. Will they be from the North Vietnam or South Vietnam? And you, you didn't want to just go blasting away at something you weren't sure about.
Mm.
So in my mind, then that put me in a primarily defensive posture of doing what I can or could do to preserve the integrity of the South Vietnamese units I worked with. I'd been in country about 7 months and was on a joint operation with a mechanized unit from the 25th Infantry Division. Uh, and it was me and Bravado, a squad or two of South Vietnamese regional forces. So we're at this Square Lake area, which was what we called, it was heavily booby trapped, and the American mechanized was trying to get a tank through there, and it was almost impossible. So anyway, I get, first of all, you know, we spot a young, I mean, this kid couldn't have been more than 10 or 12, but a lot of Viet Cong wore blue shorts. We saw one in the open, and you know, troops are supposed to stay on line. Well, immediately it became like a scattergraph. Uh, South Vietnamese soldiers running after this kid, and he disappeared into a spider hole. Well, I was the right or wrong. Um, we advisors on this team carried the Prick 25 radio, 25 pounder. And we rotated, the officers would carry it and NCO would carry it, you know, out of fairness. So I was carrying it. And I was reasonably athletic, like I made the highest score in the final PT test at Officer Candidate School Company. I was proud of that. So what happens is I'm literally sitting on a rice paddy dike and bright sunny day, and American artillery drops a smoke round on top of me. And our radio said, okay, yeah, we're right under that smoke round. Well, immediately an HE round hits. I literally see it explode. And the shrapnel, I mean, just whizzes over my head because that's what it does. Um, and the South Vietnamese, fortunately, no one was hurt because they were behind the rice paddy dike. Next thing that happened, I'm standing with the American commander, standing beside the tank, and a piece of shrapnel about the size of my hand just hits on my left arm flat and sticks. And I toss it off, and then everybody went to the ground. It had to be from our own artillery, from American artillery. It's one of those freak things. So then I'm walking a line behind an American squad and a machine gun placed out front. And the sergeant, American sergeant, is throwing hand grenades. So, oh shit, I'll throw a hand grenade. And the radio restricted my throw, and the hand grenade landed just enough in front of the machine gun position, and the ground was flat that it rolled out of range. And if I had killed them, I don't think I'd be here today. By the grace of God, it didn't happen, but they were pissed, and I don't blame them.
Yeah. So is this, so I'm not exactly sure how the prick 25 works. Was it that you have your arm going back to throw, but then it prevents you from getting
It
the arm back?
restricted my full
Right, yeah.
weight of the radio.
And
Uh,
you just obviously you didn't think about that. That didn't cross your mind before you went to
no,
shoot the grenade.
just I did not think about it.
Yeah.
And well, what happened later is I was so embarrassed. I wanted to be shot at. It's like, please shoot at me so I can redeem myself. I mean, I was tempted to just charge off. But what I did do is I took the point with my Vietnamese squad. And I hadn't walked maybe 10, 20 paces, and two soldiers came up behind me and each one grabbed me gently by the elbow and pulled me back. So I figured they must have seen what happened, and I had proven myself to them before, but the situation still haunts me.
A lot of veterans express the things you express. These, um, negative feelings about the war, about the memories. At the same time, they'll talk about the camaraderie, and they'll say, "Look, it wasn't all bad. There were good memories too." But the general takeaway is, war is terrible. Combat is terrible. A lot of them will say at the same time, though, that there's something about it that you also miss as you
Uh,
go through life. Is that true for you?
Absolutely. It's the combat high. The adrenaline factor is incredible. And I know that's why I chased women. It was the excitement of the chase. It's why I took these solo motorcycle trips and never told anybody where I was going, except when I toured in Europe or Norway. But I'd carry a handgun with me, never had to use it, obviously. but it definitely was a combat high. It becomes embedded, and it's hard to find a healthy way to replicate the combat high, without doing something destructive. It's exhilarating.
And that combat high, is it what I hear is there's just an intensity of focus. Um, every single thing, every move you make, every decision you make is important. Um, just absolute crystal, clear vision, even in I mean, everything's a paradox, right? Even in the chaos of battle, what I'm doing, there's clarity, there's, or at the very least, intense focus. Um, everything is meaningful, everything is important. Are these elements of this high?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, it's complete focus, and then there's the lit down
Mhm.
after it's over, and there's a tendency to sink. And so, what can I do to regenerate that feeling?
One of the things we've talked about is how, in some ways, this war is such a solitary war. You go into the war as an individual, you come out as an individual. Um, individuals are counting their individual days, how many days until I get out of here. Um, but when you're in the thick of it, though, that powerful bond that's created uh, with the guys you're serving with.
Well, I never doubted we had each other's back. Never doubted it. And I remember I was on my way to reunion in Branson, Missouri. I think it was. Anyway, I had a pretty bad motorcycle crash and broke 3 ribs, fractured 2 more, and had gone off road into a gully. And I knew I was hurt. I didn't know how bad. I literally crawled up the embankment. 5 minutes later, this is a remote road. This guy in his truck comes by, a small tanker, sees my helmet on the side of the road, stops, clambers down to where the motorcycle is. He spent an hour getting that motorcycle out of the woods, straightened the handlebar so I could ride it to wherever I was going. Went to the clinic. Well, no, 3 of my team members were already there. They took me to the clinic, and I'm looking at these guys, and it's like, my God, there's no other place I'd rather be. No other people I'd rather have with me than these 3 guys.